Hi, this is Vijaya from GMAT Superia. The last time in the part 1 of our presentation series, I was just talking to you about jargon, some of the language used in the official guide with respect to the sentence correction. Here I have brought to you a few words that matter when it comes to understanding the critical reasoning of the GMAT, as it is explained and discussed and used in the official guide. In fact, preparing for the critical reasoning is a very challenging, at the same time interesting thing. I mean, you wouldn't feel this to be as boring as, let's say, the reading comprehension. Now, in the critical reasoning, the source, the official guide, we see the explanations beautifully explained. The type of logic, why an answer option is right and why other ones are, wrong. In the process of understanding this explanation, we need to have a little more clarity on some of the words that are used, and most of you would have found it quite intelligible. Now this is for the people who are just beginning to prepare for the GMAT. We see the types of questions at the back, the explanations to the critical reasoning, two types. They call them the argument construction type of question and the argument evaluation type of question. The argument construction type of questions are on an average difficulty level, wherein you identify a conclusion within the paragraph that is given. You may draw an inference, you may identify the assumption behind the conclusion. You may be also asked to identify the method of reasoning or the logic used. Then the next category of question is the argument evaluation question type, wherein you are asked to weaken, strengthen, evaluate, or resolve the paradox question. Now, when it comes to these classifications, you'll also see that a lot of other words are used to substitute. For instance, weaken, they could use the word call into question, jeopardize, undermine, make the conclusion inaccurate, so on and so forth. I've just taken a few important words for discussion in this small presentation. Now, you must have come across this question type wherein you are merely asked to identify the logic used in the argument, or the other ways to express the logic are method of reasoning, a line of reasoning, etc. Now, these are not exactly premises. Instead, it is what sort of premise. Let's go through one question to understand this a little more. Okay. Now, there are different types of arguments. One is the argument by analogy. Now, there are certain similarities given in the evidence and therefore a conclusion is drawn. Now, let's study the argument. In the past, teachers, bank tellers and secretaries were predominantly men. These occupations slipped in pay and status when they became largely occupied by women. Therefore, that's a conclusion. If women become the majority in currently male-dominated professions like accounting, law and medicine, the income and prestige of these professions will also drop. The conclusion beginning with the word therefore. How is the conclusion drawn? And that is what is logic or method of reasoning. It is not important for us to see what were the professions in which women occupied, or it is not important for us to know which are the male-dominated or female-dominated professions. You are asked the logic, that is the argument above is based on, means what sort of line of reasoning, what sort of logic or what sort of method of reasoning is used. So the method of reasoning here is you're talking about a past situation and we think whatever happened then will happen now. So it is a comparison. So in logic we call a comparison as an analogy, even otherwise it is a very familiar word. So the method of reasoning or the line of reasoning used by the speaker is analogy. So the argument above is based on, is it another argument that contains circular reasoning? Circular reasoning is one in which the premise appears to be the conclusion or the conclusion appears to be the premise. Okay, this is not that way. Is it that the speaker is giving an exception to question a generalization? No. It is an analogy between past and present. So one of the common types of argument that is used in critical reasoning is argument by analogy. It is not very difficult to identify an analogy. You will always see a situation being presented, and we consider another situation and say that what happened in the first situation will happen in the second situation. It is not an appeal to belief and values. It is not attacking the character of an opposition. It is answer is C. I was trying to tell you that when you speak about the argument is based on, you are not asked to identify the specific premises, but the method of reasoning, the logic used. In analogy logic, we are looking at the relevance of the similarities, the number of relevant similarities, and how the conclusion is drawn. Second type of reasoning that you would see is exemplar logic, that is logic based on examples. Another word we could use here is inductive generalization. I think some of you would be familiar with the words inductive and deductive reasoning. The most common method of reasoning. Scientific reasoning is more inductive, that is you make observations in specific cases and you arrive at a generalization. On the other hand, we have deductive reasoning wherein we arrive at a specific conclusion through broad premises. Which of the following describes a significant flaw in the author's argument above? We need to understand two things here. One is, whenever you have a question, a significant flaw, you must first check the logic used, the line of reasoning used. Now, the significant flaw in the argument is not necessarily weaken the argument. We shall discuss weaken the argument in one of the following questions. Now, flaw in the reasoning necessitates that you understand the reasoning used. Look at this argument. Private ownership of services traditionally considered to be the responsibility of the government will typically improve those services. That means private ownership will improve services. How is the speaker arriving at this generalization? The turnpike system in the United States of the 19th century demonstrates the truth of this principle. The system which had previously been controlled by the government became a more reliable system when taken over by private organizations. Therefore, we are arriving at the conclusion that private ownership will typically improve those services. The generalization is derived through inductive method in which one example is given. Now, the method of reasoning here is example to a generalization. I think once you recognize the method of reasoning, it's very easy for you to identify the flaw. And generally for every one example to generalization, the flaw itself is that the evidence is limited. Now, is the flaw in the argument that the author is defending a conclusion by quoting an authority? No. He is distorting an opposing view. Alright, there are no two points of view. He gives an example and arrives at a generalization. Is he defending what he perceived as a wrong action by presenting another wrong action? No. The author generalizes from a sample not representative enough to establish the conclusion. So if you are asked to identify the logic, you would say that the author generalizes from an example. So it is an example to a conclusion. So the error is that it may not represent. That means from one simple case we cannot make a generalization. This is called an inductive generalization. Is the author attributing two different meanings to the same word? Is that the flaw in the line of reasoning? No. So exemplar logic comprises examples, therefore a conclusion. What are the flaws that you expect in exemplar logic? You will see that the evidence is very limited. He has arrived at a hasty generalization, or we can call it overgeneralization. Just watch these vocabulary. I mean, they're very important in eliminating options when it comes to flaw in the reasoning question. In addition to analogy and example,